Germany's U-boat division came to the fore a few months after the start of the Second World War. It was in May 1940 that Hitler finally approved the strategy of all-out attacks by U-boats on British shipping. In particular, as was the case in World War I, the focus would be on the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic between North America, namely the United States and Canada, and Britain. As we've already discussed in other videos on this channel, these merchant shipping lanes were vital for securing desperately needed equipment, armaments, steel, and manufactured materials, food, and other essential resources for Britain. Without those supplies from the US and Canada, Britain simply could not have withstood the barrage of attacks by Germany in both the sea and in the air. Hitler had taken his time in approving this strategy since he didn't want to alienate the United States, which was still neutral in 1940. But the Battle of the Atlantic, as it was famously called, had been underway since day one of the war. Hitler clearly felt more emboldened to let his U-boats create havoc, once Germany had successfully invaded and secured the Atlantic-facing ports of both France and Norway. It was in May 1940 that the U-boats began to stalk convoys for days at a time in large groupings known as wolf packs. Between the summer of 1940 and the spring of 1941, a German U-boat at sea sank an average of 8 merchant ships a month. It was what the Germans would dub their happy time or die Glückliche Zeit. It would become known as the First Happy Time. The initial damage caused by the U-boat division and its infamous wolf packs was devastating. 282 Allied ships were sunk off the northwest approaches to Ireland in just under the 4 months between July 1940 and October 1940. It amounted to a loss of 1,489,795 tons of Allied, mostly British, merchant shipping. The reason why British and Allied merchant ships were such easy targets is because convoy defenses were severely lacking in the first 18 months of the war. Radar was primitive, the technology having remained almost unchanged from the First World War. Lack of adequate radar meant that U-boats were often almost impossible to detect before they launched their nighttime surface attacks. Existing ASDIC or sonar technology could only detect U-boats that were submerged. Furthermore, naval aircraft were also of little use. They lacked sufficient range and couldn't provide coverage at night as escorts for transatlantic convoys. Germany was further able to intercept cables between American shipping insurance firms and European underwriters, thereby getting all the intel they needed on specific merchant ships, what their cargoes would be when they were sailing and to where. To say it was easy pickings for the German U-boats was an understatement of epic proportions. An interesting side detail is that the Type 7 U-boat could only carry 14 torpedoes. As such, many U-boat captains opted to use the 5-inch deck guns on their U-boats in order to save torpedoes and still be able to destroy Allied ships. This hampered their time at sea, which is why many U-boat patrols were terminated early and forced to return to their bases in France or Germany. One would have thought that maybe America joining the war in December 1941 would improve things for the Allies, but for a while it didn't. In fact, the Germans just amped up their actions, this time right along America's eastern seaboard. This U-boat operation would become known as the U-boat's Second Happy Time, or as it was known in German, der Zweite Glückliche Zeit. Officially, it was known as Operation Paukenschlag, or Operation Drumbeat. German submarine commanders would also refer to it as the American shooting season. Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini had declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, a direct response to Franklin D. Roosevelt having declared war on behalf of the United States against Imperial Japan. Pearl Harbor had been the catalyst for America's entry into World War II, which was the perfect excuse for the Germans and their Italian allies to unleash their submarines directly against American shipping. The very next day after declaring war on the U.S., namely December 12, 1941, Adolf Hitler ordered a full-on assault of America by U-boats. Legendary U-boat commander Vice Admiral Karl Dönitz was gleeful about the entry of the United States into the war. He was even more ecstatic about Hitler's order that U-boats be used as a bulwark against America. For Karl Dönitz, he finally had the perfect opportunity, and the perfect reason, to unleash the full might of his U-boat division against North American shipping. In short, Operation Drumbeat was Germany's stunning response to America declaring war. That operation entailed a group of 16 U-boats attacking American and Canadian merchant ships in wave after wave along the North American East Coast. America's initial response was so weak that U-boats were able to go as far south as the Gulf of Mexico with little pushback. Even more humiliating was the fact that a few U-boats even had the gall to roam inshore shipping lanes in the US and Canada during the first part of 1942. The effect of this brazen U-boat presence in North American waters was devastating. No less than 78 merchant ships and 1,200 merchant marines were lost in the North Carolina shipping lanes alone. Overall damage by the Axis powers was even more devastating. The Second Happy Time saw German and Italian submarines sink a total of 609 Allied ships, with more than 3.1 million tons of shipping lost. German losses were relatively minor in comparison, with just 22 U-boats lost during those hectic months in the North Atlantic and down into the Caribbean Sea. Historians have been quite damning about just how poor the initial response by America was to the U-boat threat. The historian Michael Gannon has referred to this period of U-boat bombardment of U.S. shipping as America's second Pearl Harbor. Gannon believes much of the blame for America's huge losses during this time lies with the inaction of Admiral Ernest J. King, who was the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Navy in 1942. King had refused British offers of assistance in quelling the U-boat threat. Some historians have commented that American convoys during the Second Happy Time were in fact even more exposed to U-boat attack than were lone ships making the dash across the Atlantic. In its favor, of course, was the undeniable fact that the United States possessed massive manufacturing capacity, which would certainly come into play later in the war. Nevertheless, the United States Navy had entered the war heavily exposed in the Atlantic. The Americans did not possess the equivalent of Britain's Black Swan-class sloop or the River-class frigate. America's massive new naval construction program had prioritized other classes of ships. Unfortunately, they were not apt to defend against U-boats in the Atlantic. For example, fleet destroyers did not carry a large number of depth charges and were not highly maneuverable. King even refused to make use of destroyers that were available, including at least 25 Atlantic Convoy Escort Command destroyers which were available, of which 7 were anchored in New York City Harbor. Even when released, these destroyers were assigned as offensive patrols rather than escorting convoys. The emphasis was on destroying attackers rather than stopping losses of merchant shipping. The result was mounting losses due to U-boat attacks during most of 1942. Even though King was supposed to be in charge, the United States Navy's command was fragmented. King was too distracted by his other naval duties, and as such, the effort to thwart the U-boat onslaught fell mostly on the 3 Atlantic operational commands, namely the Atlantic Fleet, the Eastern Sea Frontier, and the Gulf Sea Frontier. Unsurprisingly, this resulted in haphazard, often uncoordinated efforts that were counterproductive. This fiasco would only be resolved in May 1943 when the United States 10th Fleet was finally formed. The primary target of U-boats was what was known as the Eastern Sea Frontier, which extended south from Maine to North Carolina. All that Rear Admiral Adolphus Andrews could count on to protect that long coastal seaboard were 7 Coast Guard cutters, 4 converted yachts, 3 1919 vintage patrol boats, 2 gunboats which dated back to 1905, and 4 wooden submarine chasers. There were 100 naval aircraft available, but they were only short-range models used for training. Unlike other navies that enjoyed control over large aircraft as part of their naval fleet, all larger aircraft remained under the control of the United States Air Force. America's woes kicked off when the first of 5 Type 9 U-boats left the port of Lorient in France on December 18, 1941. What followod was carnage that lasted for months, and the American response was abysmal. For example, when U-123 sank the 9,500-ton Norwegian tanker Nornes within sight of Long Island on January 14, 1942, not a single American warship was dispatched to go and investigate the sinking. This allowed U-123 to continue without hindrance, and thereafter sink the 6,700-ton British tanker Coimbra just off Sandy Hook the very next night. By the time the first wave of U-boats returned to port in France in early February 1942, Karl Dönitz would marvel in his diary at how every U-boat had, to quote him, such an abundance of opportunities for attack that he could not by any means utilize them all. There were times when there were up to 10 ships in sight, sailing with all lights burning on peacetime courses. The Germans could hardly believe their luck. However, things were bound to change, and they eventually would. By 1943, the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic would turn in favor of the Allies. It was a decisive time that would see the gradual overhaul of U-boat supremacy in the Atlantic. How the Allies achieved that will be the basis of Part 2 of this 2-part series regarding the U-boats and their pivotal role in the Battle of the Atlantic.